Okay, so let's get started with our continuing study of the book of Daniel. Last week, we spent some time doing what I like to call context work, background work, talking about the world in which Daniel lived in. And when we talked about, just to quickly review, when we talked about the world that Daniel lived in, we talked about a world of chaos, upheaval, transition, change, a great lack of stability. That was all characterizing the world that Daniel, who we didn't meet yet, lived in. And that's going to be very significant. And we mentioned that the transitions, the changes, the upheaval, the chaos appeared on multiple levels. We talked about a political level. We talked about a religious level, a social level, a geographic level, all, a lot of upheaval. So again, in the time that we're living in, going through a global pandemic, which, perhaps in the beginning, I remember, just a side story, but I remember that in the beginning of the pandemic, when we heard it was coming, we were getting ready, and we said we were making our plans. And I remember very clearly that we were deciding when to close down the school and the shuls and so on. And in school, we said, how long are we going to close down for? That was the question that we asked. And I remember Rabbi Harari and I arguing about whether or not, we should close. It was right after Purim. So the question was, should we close for a week and then we'll decide a week later if we're going to close another week and another week, or should we just say we were closing for 3 weeks, because we said, and so the 1 week was like, okay, we'll see what this is like. It's a week. How long could it be? And then the long opinion was, listen, if it's a week, it's going to be 2. Once it's 2, you're going to open for 1 week to go to Passover. Passover will be 2 weeks, so we'll do 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 5 weeks. This thing will all be gone, And that was the head that we thought of at the time. And here we are, and it's 7 months later, and I'll sign up for 5 weeks any day at this point. It feels like we're holding our breath underwater, and it's been quite a long time. Anyway, the reason I brought that up again was because I do think that understanding the time and the stability or the lack of stability in that time is very significant to understanding the life that Daniel would have been living and what he would have been going through. I won't say that he was going through the pandemic, but at the same time, in some ways, he had a greater sense of upheaval, and he wouldn't necessarily see a quick end to it. And I think that's significant to keep in mind. Anyway, that's really where we want to that's our point of departure. We're now ready to actually meet Daniel, the person, and see what he's about. The book, just so you know, the book of Daniel is 12 chapters long. And for the most part, each chapter kind of forms a good unit. So today we're going to read chapter 1. What I'm going to do, just by sake of process today, is run through the story pretty quickly, just so that we have a basic storyline of what happens in chapter 1. And then we'll analyze. Okay, so it'll take about 5 to 7, maybe 10 minutes to read through the story. Not going to do too much explanation at that point. And then we'll come back and we'll start analyzing. Okay, so follow along with me. Again, to get the story of Daniel, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt at any point in time. That is totally fine with me. So last week we read, if you look at the screen, last week we read chapter 1, Pasuk 1 and 2, Aleph and Bet. Now we start with Gimel. ויאמר המלך לאשפנז רב סריסיו להביא מבני ישראל מזרע המלוכה מן הפרטמים. So the king, who we know to be Nebuchadnezzar, says to his chief eunuch, which is probably some high-ranking officer, whose name is Ashpenaz, he says, bring young people from Bnei Israel, from the seed of the kingdom, and from the nobles. Get high-level society people from Israel, from the Jews. ילדים אשר אין בהם כל מום וטובי מראה ומשכילים כל חוכמה ויודעי דת ומביני מדע ואשר כוח בהם לעמוד בהיכל המלך ולמדם ספר ולשון כסדים. It says, and these children of royalty, the noblemen, They should be young children that have no blemish. They are good looking. They are intellectual with all types of intellect. They should know philosophy, wisdom, or something of that nature. They should be educated, and they should have strength to stand in the king's palace, and that we could teach them the book, or the books, our books, the Ulshon Kasdim, and the words of the Babylonians. Meaning, take smart Jews, take educated Jews, and we're going to bring them into the royal palace in order to teach them our ways, the Babylonian ways. And the king will appoint for them a daily sustenance, and he'll give them food and wine. Today we'd call this a fellowship. And he'll grow them, the king will, for 2 or 3 years. And then some of these guys, some of these fellows, will end up working in the government. And amongst them came children from the tribe of Yehudah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. 4 different individuals here that we meet. One is Daniel, one is Hananiah, one is Mishael, one is Azariah. Those 4 names are listed specifically. Now each of these guys gets a new name. Daniel Belshazzar. He called Daniel Belshazzar. So he took his Hebrew name and turned it into a Babylonian name. Hananiah Shadrach, and he called Hananiah Shadrach. Mishael Meshach. Mishael is called Meshach. Azariah Abednego, and to Azariah he called Abednego. So these 4 young students get 4 new names, from Daniel to Belshazzar, Hananiah to Shadrach, Mishael to Meshach, Azariah to Abednego. Top of the next column. Vayasem Daniel alibo asher lo yitga'al b'patbag hamelech u'miyen mishtav v'avakesh misara sarishim asher lo yitga'al. And Daniel put it in his mind, literally in his heart is the way the pasuk says it, that he will not be, here's a tough word, but we're going to say disgraced by the king's food and his wine. And he asked of the chief eunuch, of the chief officer who was in charge of him, that he not have to partake, that he not have to eat this food. And Hashem had Daniel look good upon this eunuch, meaning this officer, meaning the officer thought positively of Daniel because Hashem made it that way. ויאמר שר הסריסים לדניאל, ירא אני את אדוני המלך, אשר מינת מאכלכם, את משתכם, אשר למה יראה את פניכם זועפים מן הילדים אשר כגילכם, וחייבתם את ראשי למלך. He says, listen, I like you, but, he says, I'm very fearful of Nebuchadnezzar, my king. He says, he set aside food and drink for you to eat. He says, and if he sees that your face is not looking so good, especially compared to the other children who are eating the food, says he's going to have my head. That wouldn't be so good for me. So Daniel says to this Meltzar, today means a waiter, but again, it's the minister of the king that this minister of the king appointed for Daniel, Mishael, Azariah. It says, Nasna et avadecha yamim asara v'yitnu lanu min hazeroim v'nochla u'mayim v'nishteh. He says, do us a favor. For about 10 days, try this out. Instead of giving us what they normally give us seeds, give us grains, and we'll drink water. We don't want the wine. We don't want the meat of the king. It says, and then after 10 days, you'll be able to see, do we look any different? You're afraid to see how we look? Give us 10 days. Let us eat a vegan diet, if you will, water and seeds instead of the wine and the bread that the king is wanting to give us. Okay, so that's the ask, the request that the Daniel asks of the king, but not of the king, but of his first level worker and then his second level worker. Sorry, go ahead. Someone had a question.
Yeah, Rabbi, is this for kashrut reasons, or you said not to defile?
So that's a great question. It's a great question. That's going to be when we analyze. We're going to say, hey, what happened here? Why did that happen? We don't know. Right? It doesn't say. Give me 2 minutes, and we're going to get to that exact question. So might be a little more than 2, might be 5. Yeah, Audrey, you had a question.
Yeah, hi, Rabbi. So it just brings to mind right away, because I love Jewish history, Spanish Inquisition. Isabella and Ferdinand, they did not allow the Jews to publicly celebrate their holidays. They had to do everything inside in the basement, and they had to change their names. They changed their name from Jewish names to Spaniard or whatever, because they really could not have Jewish names. So it just reminds me a little bit of parallel. And
yeah, I 100%. And wait.
And this is what I want to say. I'm sorry. It reminds me of today. I'll tell you why. We are not allowed to send our children to school, and our schools are closed and synagogues are closed. And I understand the reasoning, and I'm not going to get into that. Right. But that also reminds me of Spanish Inquisition. It reminds me of Amalek, because how did Amalek want to defeat Bnei Israel? Through taking away our connection to Hashem, maybe our names and our tefillot, how we pray, how we learn, what we teach our children, what we teach our young children especially. This is how Amalek wanted to destroy us, because they saw that wars are not going to get us to war. I mean, am I correct? Or
you are? And give me, like I told Ezra, give me 2 more minutes to just get through, because I want to. What I'd like to do is look at the full story, the full picture, and then then start making our comparisons, because there are many comparisons to make, and there are many questions to ask. So actually, both of what you did is exactly where I intend to go. Audrey making parallel connections. We're gonna do that. And Ezra asking, hey, wait a second. I see he's not eating. Why is he not eating? It didn't say so clearly why he's not eating. So those are really the 2 different directions that we're gonna go in 2 minutes. Give me 2 more minutes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Because I want you to be armed with what happens in the rest of the story. If we were talking about a story that everybody knows, so then I leave it and we stop here. But since not everyone knows the story, let's see the end of the story and then see, what we can make of both your points, because they really are very, very important. And actually, as you're going to see, exactly where I intend to go.
Thank you.
It says like this: "Vayishma lahem ladavar hazeh." So he listened to them. Vaynasem yamim asara, and he tried for 10 days. Umiktsat yamim asara, and at the end of the 10 days, nir'a marehem tov ubriye basar. They actually look good, healthy of flesh. They actually look maybe healthier than the other kids, right? The Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are on this vegan diet, are looking healthier than the rest of the Babylonian kids, and maybe other Judeans. We don't know if there were other Judeans there that are eating meat and wine. Okay, Pasuk Tet Zayin. So the waiter who was giving them, who was supposed to give them their daily allowance, the wine, the meat, and so on, and he gave them things. He says, he says, and not only that, he saw that the 4 children, Hashem had given them Mada, understanding, Bahaskel, intellect, B'chol Sefer B'chokhmah. Not only were they doing well physically, but they were doing well, shall we say, academically, intellectually, philosophically, possibly. The Daniel in particular, Hevin B'kol Chazon B'chalomot. Daniel had what we would call a visionary. He understands what we would call dreams, which we're going to get to. So this is what's going on. Keep reading. Pasuk Yud Chet. And after the days, Asher Amar HaMelech Lahaviyam, the king said to bring them. And remember, the king had said, give them 2-3 years. So the chief officer, not the waiter, the chief officer brings them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king speaks to them. And the king could not find anybody better than these 4 Judeans, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they stood before the king. Any matter of wisdom, understanding that the king would ask of them, they would be able to do 10 times better of anybody else that was in his kingdom. And Daniel was there for a while until Koresh, who we're going to get to who Koresh is. So that's our quick read of what happens in the book of Daniel, chapter 1. So quickly, let's summarize that, right? So what did we get? What's the story that we understand here? It's interesting. It's not an amazing story, but at the same time, it's a pretty cool story, right? It's not like Kriyat Yam Suf, where the sea splits, or the 10 plagues, or even it's not as fun as maybe Megillat Esther or Yonah, but it's an interesting story. So quickly, let's just summarize what's our story here. Anyone? What struck you from the story?
I thought it was interesting that he went to the Jewish people to try to find the wisdom.
To try to what?
To try to find wisdom within his people. I thought it was surprising that he went straight to the Jewish nation.
Right. So curious, based on this, do you think it was because they were Jewish?
That was my visceral thought. Yes.
Anyone disagree, and and why you might think that way? Yeah, just unmute.
Two things. First, maybe he wasn't getting what he needed from the people normally around him, so he went to look for another group. And also, the thing that struck me was these were people who were still trying to maintain their Yiddishkeit and their Jewishness in a very non-Jewish environment. And
Okay, so we're going to get to that point.
I see that parallel all the time with my daily life and my daily work environment.
Right. So we're gonna talk about that point. Is going to be a major point, and no question that's something that's significant. But what's interesting to me is, I don't know that initially the king is looking for Judeans per se, right? I think it sounds like this is something that he does, right? He's a world conqueror. Wherever he goes, he says, "Let me take some of the sharp guys and actually bring them into my cabinet," right? I think that's what he's trying to do, is to try and take, what you might call a few good men from everywhere, right? And to bring them into his world, and that's the key, right? He's not doing it for their Jewishness, right? He's doing it to turn them into good Babylonian servants, civil servants, effectively, right? That seems to be what he's trying to do, which makes sense, right? And so I think that that's important to see, is that's what the king is trying to do, is to take, I don't think he's looking for Jews per se. I think he just thinks, hey, they must have some sharp people. Let me get some of their talent also, but I'm sure there's plenty of examples of that in all sorts of walks of life, politics, academics, entertainment, sports, and so on. I think there's a lot of that. Okay, great. What else struck you? So we talked about the fact that the king would populate his cabinet or his advisors with Jews. We talked about the fact that there's a clear recognition of the struggle to stay Jewish in a foreign land, which we're going to get to. That's a major point in the story. Anything else that struck you just factually about the story? Anything that was there? Okay, so the next thing I want to do is actually show you, well, actually, before I get to that, hold on. How do I close that? Hold on. Yeah, the next thing I wanted to do was talk about the point that Audrey had talked about, which is parallels, right? And I want to stay biblical for the moment, although Audrey made some good parallels to the Middle Ages and the Spanish Inquisition. What parallels can you find between this story and other stories in the Tanakh? There's some very clear, obvious ones. Yeah.
Queen Esther.
Right, Queen Esther. In what way?
First, the food. She also didn't eat when she was first brought in, before she was picked as queen. Doesn't say also she ate with her. She ate different foods too. I seem to remember reading that somewhere.
It's not so much that she doesn't eat foods, but she refuses something else from the king, right?
She also kept her own. She also kept her own name as well.
Well, actually, that's going to be something that that's actually a parallel, but a parallel, not that she kept her own name. Her own name was Hadassah, Esther, right? So Esther, which, is among the most Jewish names that we have today, is actually not such a Jewish name, right? We're pretty clear that the names Esther and Mordechai are they are names of foreign gods. Mordechai is Marduk, and Esther is Ishtar. So we're pretty clear that those names, although we've sanctified them at this point, their initial names were actually kind of Goyish, if you will. They were not initially Jewish names. So that's something. Yeah, Audrey, you look like you had wanted to say.
Mitzrayim, yeah, it's coming out. I'm thinking of Mitzrayim. The Jews changed their names and
right. So we see. So the other story that's very parallel is the story of Yosef in Mitzrayim, right?
You mentioned Chalomot.
What's that?
You mentioned Daniel Havi B'chol Chazon Chalomot, that he could.
Right. So you mentioned the dreams are connections, and we're going to see more of that as we go along. But you know what? Let me just throw up. Hold on one second. Let me throw my screen back up again. I made a kind of an informal list of parallels between the stories of Esther and Yosef and Daniel. So let's start with my first point, right? In all three stories, right, you have a young Jew in the court of a foreign ruler, right? And that's a very significant parallel, right? And those are pretty much, I think, you could probably come up with some others, but those are the primary stories in the Tanakh about a young Jew in the court of a foreign ruler, which is something that becomes a big issue all the way throughout history. Examples of that are Abarbanel in the Spanish Inquisition is certainly one, and you could even use Jared Kushner in the White House today. So definitely cases. But all three stories, this is very prominent. In all three stories, the young Jew takes on a new name. As we mentioned, Daniel is Belshazzar. Esther is that's her new name. She was actually Hadassah. That was her original name, it seems, from the story of the book of Esther. And Yosef, anyone know what Yosef's name is? Yosef actually takes on an Egyptian name, Safnat Paneah. Safnat Paneah. So that's interesting in and of itself, that each of them assumes a new name, which is interesting because I think you may remember there's a very famous midrash that talks about the idea that Jews don't change their names when they go into foreign countries. But here we see all three did, interestingly enough. The presence of wine and drink finds itself prominent in all three stories. In Daniel, we saw he refused to drink it. In Esther, every story has wine and drink in it. And Yosef has the butler, and also you could argue the goblet that he gives to Binyamin also speaks to the presence of wine and drink in the story. In each of the stories, someone is overseen by a minister. So, for example, we saw here that Daniel is overseen by the Rav Sarisim Ashpenaz, but also by the Meltzar, the waiter. Esther is overseen by Hegai, Sri Samelech, and Shashgaz, and others. And in Yosef, right, we see that he's in the jail and he's overseen by the jailer, and that has a key part in the story as well. So in each of the stories, there's like a bureaucracy and a mid-level that they deal with. Next piece is the good looks in all three stories, uncharacteristic of the Tanakh, because the Tanakh does not often talk about looks. The Tanakh is very rarely concerned with the looks of its characters. I once read somewhere, I can't remember where I saw this, but a comparison between the ancient Greek writings like of Homer and the Tanakh. And Homer is, I found it very boring to read, maybe others did not, but Homer is incredibly expressive of the way his characters looked, Whereas in the Tanakh, what did Moshe Rabbeinu look like? I don't know. David HaMelech, do we really know what he looks like? Not much. There's very few characters that we have any physical details at all, which is very interesting. But here, all three are listed as being good looking. It doesn't go deep into what their good looks are about, but nevertheless, the emphasis on the good looks, which is always being placed upon them by the outside, right? Well, Yosef actually, he knows he's good looking from the beginning, but there's a lot of outside emphasis on how he looks, specifically from the wife of Potiphar, right? Esther doesn't want to look good, but they make, that she ends up looking good. And Daniel, he didn't ask to be chosen, but he was chosen because he's good looking. So I think that's a common bond between all the stories. In at least two of the stories, we have panim zo'afim, upset faces, right? Daniel, the waiter doesn't want the face to be upset, and Yosef speaks to the butler and the baker and says, "Why do you guys have upset faces after they had the dreams at night?" In all three of the stories, you have someone who refuses to follow the law, right? What are the examples? Well, Daniel doesn't eat the food that's given to him. What are the examples in the story of Esther? Right? Where's the example in the book of Esther where someone won't follow the law?
Won't bow down.
What's that?
Mordechai won't bow down.
Right, Mordechai won't bow down. Also, Esther won't do like all the other women, right, who prepare themselves extensively. She refuses. So that's something that's interesting. And in Yosef, right, Yosef refuses to follow the law. This one's a little bit of a stretch because I won't call it a law, right? But Yosef refuses to follow the advances of his mistress, right, of the wife of Potiphar.
Potiphar's wife.
Right. She's his boss, right? And he will not do what she said, right? And so that's interesting. In all three stories, there's a theme of off with his head, right? In case you thought this was invented by the French Revolution, right? It appears in each one of the three stories, right? In Daniel, right, the waiter says, "Hey, if you guys don't eat the food that the king told me that you have to eat, I'm worried he's going to take my head off," right? And of course, we know whose head does get taken off effectively in the book of Esther, right? Is Haman gets hung by the neck, right? And in Yosef's story, right, the butler, the baker, right, the butler has a good out, right? He gets back to the king, and ultimately that's how Yosef gets out of jail, right? But the baker doesn't have such a good thing, right? And actually, he gets hung, right? So off with his head is a common theme in each of those stories, which is not such a common theme in the Tanakh. And we talked about the depressed faces. I don't know why I showed it twice. But what's interesting about this is, right, what do we make of all this, right? These are not by accident, right? These, if we're looking at this, what do we have to say? Right. I think one of the things that we have to say is that these stories are meant to be read together, right? They are not meant to be read independently. The fact that they have all of these commonalities, it's just screaming out to us saying, hey, wait a second. These stories are of a particular genre, they're a particular type. They're meant to be compared and contrasted. And to not compare and contrast them would to not understand them, right? Okay, so I see Audrey is bringing one of the great comparer and contrasters of our time, right? Judy Klitzner, who I'm trying to see which book you have there because she is.
It's called Subversive
Sequels
in the Bible.
Right. So basically, these are that, right? There's no question that that's what you have here.
Interesting.
And it's meant to be read that way. No question. No question. So if anyone has not read Klitzner's book, it's definitely worth reading. Subversive Sequels in the Bible.
Subversive Sequels in the Bible.
Right. So
Okay.
go ahead.
Klitzner. Judy Klitzner.
Judy Klitzner, yeah. So definitely, I'll put it in the chat. Hold on one second.
I'm going to shut my tape.
And force Biden to defend the Obama administration's record on that issue.
Hold on, I'm putting it in the chat. Yeah. That's the name of the book. And definitely, if you're interested, it's certainly something that's worthwhile reading. So there's no question that we're intended to look at these three stories together and to draw from them. So that's what I wanted. Just we could spend just based on the parallels that we just drew. We could spend hours just today talking about commonalities. But I just want to use one of them, which is what Ezra pointed out, right? Which is, hey, it's not so clear. Why is it that Daniel would not eat from the food? And that's going to be my next question, right? So the question is, why won't he eat of the food, right? Why won't he, right? And so the question is, Daniel won't eat the food, right? So why might he not eat of the food? So let's look. What are some of the reasons we could come up with? What's the obvious reason why Daniel would not eat from the food?
Kashrut.
Right, kashrut? Right, the easy answer is Daniel won't eat something unkosher. What's the problem with saying that? Right, why is that maybe not the best answer, even though it's a good answer, but what's wrong with that answer?
Sakanat nefesh.
So number one, if it's sakanat nefesh, who cares about kosher, right? Eat, right? You know, so for example, like we would say about Esther, right? Esther probably shouldn't have slept with Ahashverosh, but what could she do? If she didn't, she'd be dead, right? You know, so she's allowed, maybe. But okay, we'll leave that one, right? But yeah, we know sakana nefesh. What's another reason why it's unlikely that the issue that Daniel is not eating from the food is because of kashrut?
Because the food he was eating also wouldn't have been kosher as well. He was eating even the grains and the nuts and whatnot wasn't kosher either.
Water. It's hard to have unkosher grains and water, especially outside of Israel. Pretty safe. So I hear it, but it doesn't seem like it. I think something else that might be a possibility, right, is one of the reasons why I don't like kosher as a reason is you don't find in the Torah that, of course, there are the laws of kashrut, but you don't find pretty much anywhere in the history of the Tanakh where someone is being castigated for not keeping kosher. Usually, the sins that the Torah bothers people about are murder, avodah zarah, incest, lack of tzedek u'mishpat, lack of honesty, good human interactions. You don't find too often the Torah or the Navi or anyone really criticizing for kosher. So even though today, in our time, kosher is a big deal, in the Tanakh, kosher is not usually a big deal, which makes it odd for it to seem like this would be about kosher, especially if Daniel doesn't say it's about kosher. But hold the thought. Perhaps there's something else.
I don't know what the story was with, sort of like teetotaling at the time, whether the wine could be separated from the food, whether he was afraid what would happen if he got drunk.
Could be the drinking, but it seems like it's not just the drinking. One possibility that some people have put forward is that we see later that the rabbis of the Gemara, they say that there's a rule about eating the food of non-Jews. Today we call this the rules pat akum and bishul akum, right? The baked foods and the cooked foods of non-Jews. And there's a decree that we not eat those things so that we not intermingle with them, right? So the difficulty with that concept or that explanation is, hey, if that's a rabbinical decree, Daniel would have been historically before the rabbinical decree. And it's hard to imagine, although Daniel sometimes as listed as one of the early rabbis, one of the early rabbinical figures, here he's just a kid. To have him inventing a decree is hard to picture. So the third possibility is, as some of you have already pointed out, it's about his identity, right? That Daniel was looking for a way to keep and maintain his identity as a Judean. And this was what he could do. This was kind of like a form of protest, if you will, that he was not going to be a good completely Babylonian. He couldn't be a bad Babylonian because he'd be dead, but he wanted to be not a good Babylonian. And in this way, it seems like he's protesting something. I want to support that by comparison. What's the reason Yosef doesn't sleep with Potiphar's wife? All right, what's the reason? What do you think? Why do you think Yosef does not sleep with Potiphar's wife? Well, there's the obvious reason, right?
Because it's wrong.
Right. Well, that it's wrong because it's an incestuous relationship, right? Either because she's not Jewish, or because she's someone else's wife, or it's extramarital. It's not at all marital for him, right? All those reasons, and that seems to be the classic explanation. Now, not every rabbi explains it that way. In fact, the Ramban explains it as that rule didn't apply to Yosef, especially in his situation. But what did apply to Yosef, and what seems to bother him in the words of the pasuk, is a lack of loyalty. Yosef was loyal to his master, Potiphar, who put him in charge of things in the house. And one of the things was, don't touch the master's wife, right? And to touch the master's wife would be a sign of disloyalty to Potiphar. And that's definitely another way of explaining things. But I wanted to bring a third way, which was exactly the way that we explained Daniel, which is identity, based on a Gemara in Masechet Sotah. It's a famous Gemara because Rashi brings it up, although he changes it a little bit. So I wanted to look at it in its pure form. All right, so look at this. It says like this. The verse states, and she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me, right? So this is, of course, talking about the wife of Potiphar, right? The pasuk says, she grabbed him by the garment, and she said, lie with me. Now, that's the pasuk. So now are the words of the rabbis interpreting this or expanding upon it, filling in the gaps. They said, at that moment, his father's image came and appeared to him in the window, right? This part is very famous, right? The part of Yosef kind of seeing his father's image in the window. Now, the truth is, it means that they had a glass window. It means that Yosef looked like his father. These are well, interesting points, but okay. The image said to him, Joseph, the names of your brothers are destined to be written on the stones of the ephod, and you are to be included among them, right? Meaning, what's this saying? That you may recall that on the clothing that the Kohen Gadol would wear, the names of the 12 tribes appeared, right? So the Kohen Gadol the high priest wore special clothing in the Mikdash, and on that clothing, the names of the 12 tribes were there. And says the image of Yosef had of his father that, hey, one day your name is supposed to be on that group, right? He says, do you desire your name to be erased from among them and to be called an associate of promiscuous women? Do you want to be part of the Kohen Gadol's clothing, or do you want to be associated with this basically promiscuous, incestuous woman? It says, who keeps company with harlots wastes his riches. The pasuk in Mishleh says, if you hang around prostitutes, you're going to waste your money. As he loses honor, which is more valuable than wealth, right? And here he'd be losing more than that, right? So what's this saying? Right? What's the idea here?
He saw an image of his father, and that brought him back to reality almost.
Right, but in other words, how does he view, if he would sleep with this woman, according to this, what's the problem? The problem isn't that he's not allowed to sleep with her, right? That's not the problem, right? And the problem isn't that he's not loyal to his master, right? What's the problem?
His name will be erased.
Right, his name will be erased, which means what? What does it mean his name will be erased? Who cares? Why does he care if his name is going to be on a plaque, 1,000 years from now or whatever it is?
Because he's losing his honor. And honor is more important than wealth.
And he won't be part of the community. Like he won't be part of the community anymore.
Right, it's more than his honor. Your name's not on the plaque because it means you're not one of Bnei Yisrael. In other words, Yosef realized that if he sleeps with this Egyptian woman, he's Egyptian. He's no longer, and not that Egyptian is so terrible. I mean, it is, but that's not the point. right? It's that by sleeping with this woman, he has now completely assimilated into their culture. He's completely become one of them. And Yosef did not want to be one of them. And that's why it's the image of his father and the image of what could be in the future that brings him back, right? The truth is, Yosef doesn't feel very much like part of Am Yisrael at this point, right? Am Yisrael took him and threw him into a pit. Am Yisrael took him and sold him off. And as we know, they didn't come looking for him. And he knows that, right? And he's now starting a new life and a new culture. He's made some progress. He's become the right-hand man of a powerful person. And if he sleeps with this woman, it's just another leg up in society that he has, right? But he realizes, hey, wait a second. If I do that, am I foregoing the possibility of being part of Am Yisrael? And his thought is, yes, I am. Right? So again, what I'm trying to do is parallel the two stories and say that Daniel and Yosef, like Mordechai and Esther in their own right, each had to take a stand, right? And that's the real point here, is that when you're in a foreign country, when you answer to a foreign power, when you're the Jew in the foreign court, you're going to ultimately have to draw a line, right? And Daniel draws that line, and he draws it very early, right? And he draws the line in a particular area, which is the food. But it's interesting, what is the food really, right? What does the food represent? We used the term before. I want to go back to that term, right? What was the term? The food wasn't about the food. What is it?
Identity? Did you say identity?
So the food is not so much identity. The food is like a fellowship, right? What's a fellowship today? Right, a fellowship is someone says, "Hey, I'm going to sponsor you. I'm powerful. I'm wealthy. I'm connected. I'm going to put you somewhere. I'm going to give you something," and it seems very benevolent, right? It seems very charitable, and often it is, but there's always an agenda behind it, right? There's always I'm doing this. Why am I doing it? Because I expect something, right? When there's a fellowship, right? You have to write a thank you letter. You have to know what whoever gave the fellowship, what they had in mind for it, and so on. When there's a sponsor, right? When someone sponsors you, who's my sponsor? I answer to my sponsor. So Daniel knows that by eating of this bread, he's adopted a Babylonian sponsor, right? And if he has a Babylonian sponsor, then who's his ruler? His ruler is the Babylonian sponsor, and he has to draw a line for himself and for others to say, listen, I don't owe you that much. I am independent. I can maintain my identity. Now back to the point, Ezra, I can maintain my identity because I've maintained my independence. I'm not dependent upon them because I recognize my real dependence is on Hashem, right? And I think that's the key part of the story here. Right? The key part of the story of Daniel is he takes a relatively small measure, right? He doesn't starve himself, right? He just becomes vegan, which today some people think is, maybe even better to do, right? But it's a sacrifice, but he's not throwing himself into the lion's den or the fire yet. We're going to see that. He actually does have to later, but that's not the step that he takes here. Here, he's taking a very simple step. He's saying, listen, I'm not going to let them own me. And if that means that I'm not going to eat the food, so be it, right? And of course, they couldn't understand. Like, what do you mean? The waiter says, I cannot give you the food. The king expects you to take this food. The king wants you to take this food, right? So he can't get past that, right? He can't get past that concept. But nevertheless, Daniel holds firm. He gives him a little bit of a test. He says, "Give me 10 days, and I'll show you. It won't hurt me. It might even help." Right? And that ends up to be what happens because Hashem makes it all work out, right? But the idea that we're seeing here is that Daniel makes a major step that takes a major step as effectively one of the first Jews. He is before Esther. Right? He lives before Esther, and we're going to come back to that in a second. But he's one of the first Jews to ever have to live outside of the land of Israel and be in a position of power. And he teaches us a very, very important thing, which is you have to make sure that you maintain your identity. And that means that you're probably going to have to sacrifice something. And that means that one of the things you're probably going to have to sacrifice is, hey, who owns you? Who are you dependent upon? Now, the truth is, this develops into something very significant. Remember, I told you in the time of the Bible, in the time of the Tanakh, kashrut wasn't so emphasized. You don't see the prophets railing about against the people about eating unkosher, even though they probably weren't keeping kosher. But keeping kosher in a foreign place is much, much more significant. And Daniel is probably the one that shows us, without thinking he's thinking kosher, but he probably turns kashrut into a marker of a good Jew, right? It is from here that the beginning of being a good Jew starts with being, do you keep kosher? Today, right, when you're asking people, how do you evaluate whether a person is Jewish or not? So there's different things people use. Do you keep Shabbat? Do you belong to a synagogue, right? Those are certainly things that help understand whether a person is kosher and what level, whether a person identifies as Jewish and how strongly they do. But I would argue that keeping kosher is one of the greatest markers, and has been for a long time, of whether or not a person keeps kosher. And it is here that Daniel establishes that. That's not something from Hashem, right? It's not something, Hashem, of course, cares that we keep kosher, but he kind of just lists it along the list of all the other mitzvot. But it's Daniel who makes this an identifying marker. And I think that's very significant. It becomes a marker when you're in a foreign culture, right? Truth is, right, we've all been to Israel, right? How hard is it to keep kosher in Israel, right? And in an all Jewish society, it's pretty easy, right? It doesn't mean much. There's no sacrifice. It doesn't show anything that you're keeping kosher when you're in Israel, right? Talk to Israelis about keeping kosher. Either they do or they don't. It's a function of where they live, right? But it's not a function of like, I keep kosher. Whereas in America, or even more, right? Because we're in New York, which is even easier, right? But go outside of New York, right? Keep kosher. It's like, that's what it is to be Jewish.
Deal,
right?
Rabbi. How about deal?
Right. Deal somewhere in between, right? Deal's not so bad, right? Go to Pittsburgh, right? Go to Omaha, right? Go to Houston. And these are, by the way, there are good Jewish communities there. It's not like New York, right? It's not like New York. You got to work to keep kosher. I have a relative, Carrie, you do as well, right? That is in Indianapolis for the last couple of years in dental school,
Maybe.
right? Yeah. There's sort of a kosher restaurant, right? And that's about it, right? There's nothing there, right? So, but he keeps kosher, and I assure you that for him, keeping kosher is like, it's the thing that you hold on to that keeps you Jewish. And I think Daniel really established that. And I think that's a major takeaway from what we see in Daniel. He wasn't, I don't think he was thinking it that way. Maybe he was, he is a visionary, but even if he wasn't, his strong stance of what he was thinking about becomes a very, very significant signal for us, and something that we remember forever and impacts our lives. What's interesting also, and with this I'm gonna close, is that we see that when we go to the story of Esther and Mordechai, which comes later, it doesn't say expressly that the people don't keep kosher, but the rabbis of the Gemara understand that the party that they went to in the beginning, where there's all this food, they assume the Jews went, and they assume they didn't keep kosher, which means that Daniel, and that was, according to them, the source of all the problems that take place after, which means that Daniel set a precedent that not everybody keeps. And if you don't keep the precedent, say the rabbis, the problem comes about. So that's kind of where I want to stop today. I'm going to just, add a summary point here, right? What is the first thing we learn about being in a foreign country or in a foreign court, or being a Jew in a foreign court, right? Is this point that we just said, which is, hey, you're going to have to find ways to maintain your identity. You're going to have to find ways to show you're Jewish, to show your independence. These are all key things that we're going to need to do. And we see that Daniel did extremely, extremely well. He was successful then, but not only was he successful then, which, okay, you say that worked for you, but actually he becomes the model for future generations. And it's a pretty amazing thing to see, a pretty amazing thing to see. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and happy to open up the floor to any thoughts, comments, or questions. But you know, I think you can already see that the story of Daniel is a very, very significant one. It's so significant that it's impacted us in ways that we didn't even know that's really where it's sourced from, and things that are very important to us actually trace back to the actions of Daniel.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Any thoughts, questions, comments?
Rabbi, it almost is like the Jews in Mitzrayim, because also what you say about what keeps us our identity, they kept their names and things like that to still maintain being Jewish in this foreign land, even as slaves.
Right. So that statement is made by the rabbis Shalal, Levush, Lashon, and Shemot, and the names, which is interesting because we actually see that the names that they take, it's actually not true, right? Meaning the names, like the name Moshe, right, is an Egyptian name, right? And Yosef takes on Safnat Paneach and marries an Osnat and so on. So it's not so simple that they actually kept their names, and we see that he dresses like an Egyptian and so on. So it's not so simple that they actually did that, but the rabbis do nevertheless make the point that that's what you have to do, right? And so absolutely, it's definitely something that's significant.
And also, just as an aside, my sister-in-law is from Calgary, Alberta, and talk about nothing kosher. When her parents came to visit a while back, they were so excited to just eat at Garden of Eden because it was just such a treat for them.
Right.
Nothing in Calgary. Right.
No, for sure. It's a, you know, if you're from out of town, or even when we travel out of town, it's a big challenge. And that's what Daniel was in. You know, that's what he was living in. Okay, I'm gonna cut out over here because I have a school program in just a little bit. But it's great to see everyone. Hope to see you next Monday, same bad time, same bad channel.
Thank you, Rabbi.